Chapter 10. The Weekend My Sister Came. Ren showed up unannounced on a Saturday, 3 weeks into what I was still calling, to anyone who asked, sorting out the estate, and I understood within about 4 minutes of her arrival that she had not driven 4 hours north simply to check on a house. "You've been up here a month," she said, dropping her bag on the porch and looking at me with the specific narrow-eyed assessment she'd been aiming at me since we were children, the one that had always been uncomfortably accurate. "You haven't mentioned the realtor once. You haven't complained about missing the office. Which, Kamari, you complain about missing the office when you're on a 2-day conference in the same city. Something's different. You look—" She tilted her head, studying me like I was a drawing with a line out of place. "You look rested. It's unsettling." I didn't get a chance to formulate a suitably evasive answer before Maverick's truck came down the gravel road, right on schedule for the Saturday morning work he'd taken to doing, even though the major repairs were long finished, a fact I hadn't examined too closely because I liked what it implied. And Ren watched him get out of the truck, watched the easy, unthinking way I met him at the porch steps, and took the toolbox out of his hands before he had to carry it himself. Watched, I'm fairly sure, exactly the specific warmth in my own face that I hadn't been aware I was broadcasting, and I saw her put the whole equation together in about 2 seconds flat, faster than I had, if I'm honest, though I'd had a month's head start. "Oh," she said quietly, to herself more than to either of us, and then, recovering, stuck her hand out to Maverick with a bright, easy friendliness that I would later understand was entirely genuine and not remotely the performance I initially feared. "You must be the caretaker. I'm Ren, the sister nobody warned you about." "Maverick," he said, shaking her hand, giving her the careful, cataloging look I remembered from our own first meeting, though it eased faster this time. Some tension going out of his shoulders, as he apparently decided within a few seconds that whatever Ren was, she wasn't a threat. She was, in fact, the opposite of a threat, and I want to say that plainly, because it mattered more than I expected it to. She spent that whole Saturday finding excuses to be near both of us, asking Maverick easy, genuine questions about the repair work, about the lake, about a photograph she noticed through the window, the framed dawn shot in the entryway, and I watched her ask him about it with real curiosity, watched him answer haltingly at first, and then, when it became clear she wasn't going to make him feel small for caring about it, more openly, until by early afternoon the two of them were standing at the dock discussing shutter speeds while I made lunch, and something in me that had spent a lifetime bracing for my family's reaction to exactly this scenario simply sat down and rested, for the first time in longer than I could remember. She caught me alone that evening, on the porch, while Maverick was down at the boathouse locking up for the night. "You love him," she said. "Not a question. It's been a month, Ren. I've watched you not love people for 35 years, Kamari. I think I know the difference." She sat down next to me, quieter than her usual register, more careful. "Does he know? About Dad and the cousin thing, and all the reasons you've spent your whole life building a life nobody could ask questions about. He knows some of it. And he's still here." "He's still here," I agreed, and something in my chest did something complicated and warm, saying it out loud to someone who mattered to me in an entirely different way than Maverick did, but mattered enormously all the same. "I don't know what I'm doing, Ren. I don't have a plan for this. I've never not had a plan for something this big in my entire adult life." "Maybe that's the point," she said. "Maybe some things don't get better for having a plan attached to them." She bumped my shoulder with hers, an old childhood gesture neither of us had grown out of. "For what it's worth, and I recognize it's not the opinion you've spent your life bracing for, I think he's wonderful, and I think you look like yourself again for the first time since you started that company, and I would very much like to be invited back up here before the leaves turn, because I already like him more than I like most of your old boyfriends, and there weren't even any of those to compare him to. So that's saying something." I laughed, the real thing, and felt something in my chest ease that I hadn't fully realized was still braced. "There's a work thing," she added, almost as an afterthought, digging her phone out of her bag. "Sorry, I should have led with this. I got distracted by you being disgustingly happy. Priya's been trying to reach you, something about the Callaway retreat. Apparently, Preston Calloway's people want to scope out a lakeside property for the firm's autumn leadership retreat. And somebody on your team mentioned you'd inherited a place up here. And now everyone's very excited about the optics of Solane's founder personally hosting it at his own family property. Priya thinks it's a fantastic story for the firm. I think you should probably call her back before she loses her mind. I felt something in my stomach tighten at that, small and distant at the time, easy to set aside in the warm, easy glow of that particular evening. Wren beside me, Maverick's truck light swinging back up toward the house, the whole day sitting in my chest like something I wanted to hold on to exactly as it was. I did not yet understand how directly that phone call was about to collide with everything I'd built in the last month. I only knew that night that I was happier than I had been in years, and that happiness, I would learn very soon, does not come with any guarantee of being handled carefully by the rest of your life just because you finally decided to let yourself have it. Chapter 11. The words I chose wrong. Preston Calloway arrived on a Thursday with two of his executive team, and Priya, my own head of operations, flown up specifically to walk the property and, in Priya's words, fall in love with it enough to greenlight the budget. And I want to be honest that some part of me was glad for the excuse to show the place off, to have my professional world finally intersect with the one I'd been quietly building here for a month, as if I could simply hold both halves of my life in the same hand without either of them noticing the other. I did not tell Maverick in advance exactly how much I wanted him there that day. I told myself this was because it hadn't come up naturally, but the truth, which I only understood clearly afterward, was that some old, well-practiced part of me had already started calculating the optics of the day before I'd consciously decided to let it, and that calculation had quietly decided, without asking the rest of me, that a workday was not the day to test how comfortable I really was with being seen. Maverick came by anyway, mid-morning, to finish reattaching a porch rail. He'd started the day before, not knowing the house was full of my colleagues, and I watched Preston Calloway, a broad, genial man who had made an enormous amount of money in commercial real estate and had opinions about most things, delivered with the specific confidence of a man who had never once been told to keep them to himself, clock Maverick's arrival and ask, in the easy, unthinking way of someone who considers himself charming rather than crude, "Who's your handyman, Kamari?" Good-looking kid. Bet the local ladies keep him busy. I felt the whole moment narrow down to a single point. Priya glancing at me, Preston waiting on his joke with the easy expectation of a man used to being laughed along with, Maverick a few feet away, close enough to have heard every word, his hands gone very still on the porch rail he was working on. And I laughed. Not much. A small, easy, professional laugh, the kind I'd perfected over 9 years of rooms exactly like this one, the kind designed to move a conversation along without giving anyone anything real to hold on to. And I said, "He does good work, I'll say that much." And I watched, in the half second after I said it, Maverick's shoulders go from still to something harder, something that had closed like a door slamming somewhere far off. And I understood too late exactly what I had just done. I had not corrected Preston. I had not said actually, he's the reason this whole property still exists. And he's the most talented photographer I've ever met. And also, incidentally, my partner, if it's any of your business, which it isn't. I had done the thing I had spent 21 years perfecting. I had let the moment pass, smoothly, professionally, at someone else's expense, and told myself, even as I was, doing it, that it was simply not the right context, that Preston Calloway's opinion of the firm mattered more in that specific hour than one uncomfortable moment, that I would make it right with Maverick later, privately, the way I had always made things right privately, safely, where no one important could see the correction happening. The retreat conversation went well. Preston loved the property, loved the lake, loved the story Priya was already shaping about the founder's family legacy, and by the time his car pulled away down the gravel road that evening, I had, on paper, secured one of the largest contracts of the year. And I felt, watching the dust settle behind his tires, absolutely nothing like a man who had just won anything at all. I found Maverick at the boathouse. He wasn't working. He was sitting on the little dock at the edge of it, in almost the exact spot I'd first seen him standing the night we met, and he didn't turn around when I came down the path. though I know he heard me. "I owe you an apology," I said. "You don't owe me anything I don't want to collect on," he said, and I recognized, with a sick lurch, that he was quoting his own words back to me from that very first night about the invoice, except this time there was nothing warm underneath it, just a flat, careful distance that felt like the door from the first week, fully closed, dead-bolted, a room I'd been let into and had just been shown out of. "Maverick." You laughed. He still hadn't turned around. His voice was level, terribly level, the specific evenness of a man working very hard to keep something enormous from getting out. "A man made a joke about the ladies I keep busy, in front of your business partner, in front of your own team, standing 4 feet from me, and you laughed and said I do good work. Like I was—" He stopped, started again. "Like I was staff you were vouching for, not anything else, not anyone else." "I panicked," I said, and heard, even as I said it, how small the word sounded next to what it was trying to cover. "It wasn't the right moment, Preston's not." "There's never going to be a right moment," he said, and finally turned to look at me, and his face wasn't angry, which somehow made it so much worse. It was tired, old tired, the specific exhaustion of a man who has been here before, exactly here, more than once. "That's the thing you don't understand yet, Kamari, because you've never had to live it the way I have. There's no perfect moment where being seen suddenly becomes safe. You just have to decide to be seen anyway, at the actually inconvenient moment, in front of the actually important people. Or you don't decide it at all, and it doesn't matter how many quiet, private corrections you make to me later on a dock where nobody else can hear them. I spent years being somebody's secret. I organized rallies for people's right to exist openly, and then I went home to relationships where I was the thing nobody mentioned at the family dinner, the roommate, the friend, the guy who does good work. I promised myself, after everything happened, after I lost the apartment and the job and the family and very nearly lost worse than that I would never again let myself be someone's convenient omission. And I just stood on that porch and watched you omit me to a man who matters to your business in under 3 seconds, without even having to think about it. That's not who I want to be to you." "I believe that you don't want it," he said, quiet. And that was somehow the worst part. The fact that he wasn't accusing me of malice. Just of the same old cowardice he'd apparently learned to recognize instantly in anyone from years of practice. "I don't think you're a bad man, Kamari. I think you're a careful one. The same way I used to be a loud one, right up until it cost me everything. I just don't know if I can build something with somebody whose first instinct, under any real pressure, is still to make me smaller so the room stays comfortable. I've lived on the other side of that instinct before. I know exactly how it ends." I didn't have an answer for that. I stood on that dock with the evening going purple over the water, the same water he'd photographed 100 times before I ever showed up to complicate his ownership of it. And I understood that I had, in one small, unthinking laugh, undone a month of every careful, patient thing we'd built, and that no amount of explaining the pressure I'd felt in that moment was going to change the fact that he had felt the actual weight of it land on him, not on me. "I need some time," he said, standing, not looking at me. "Not forever. Just time. I can't be around you right now and trust that the next room won't go the same way." I let him go. I want to be honest that everything in me wanted to grab his arm, to argue, to explain myself into a corrected version of the afternoon, and I let him go instead, because some quieter, more honest part of me understood that he was right, and that the only thing worse than his walking away that night would have been my finding some clever way to talk him out of the walking away without actually becoming a different man in the process. I watched his truck lights disappear down the gravel road, and I stood alone on the dock for a long time after, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the quiet of that lake didn't feel peaceful at all. It felt like exactly what it was, the sound of something I had built very carefully, over one honest month, coming apart because of a single dishonest second I hadn't even had to think about to produce. Chapter 12. Silence has a shape. He didn't answer my calls for 4 days, and I want to describe what those 4 days were like, because I think silence has a shape, an actual physical weight, and I had never once in my adult life let myself feel the full weight of it before, having always arranged my life so precisely that there was rarely anyone whose silence could cost me anything at all. I stayed at the lake house instead of driving back to the city, which surprised Priya, who called twice about Callaway retreat logistics and got, both times, a version of me so distracted and short that she finally asked, carefully, whether everything was all right, and I told her it was, which was the first outright lie I'd told her in 9 years of working together, and I felt it sit badly in my chest the whole rest of the call. I saw him once from a distance on the second day, his truck outside a house 2 properties down the shore, where he apparently did caretaking work for an elderly couple who wintered in Florida, and I did not go to him, because I understood, with a clarity that surprised me, that showing up uninvited to argue my case in front of strangers would only prove the exact point he'd made on the dock, that I still didn't fully understand the difference between a private correction and an actual change. Ruthie, when I came in for coffee on the third day looking, by her own unsparing assessment, like a man whose dog died, did not pretend not to know what had happened. Small towns, I was learning, absorbed and redistributed information with an efficiency that would have impressed my own PR department. "He told you something true, and you didn't like how it felt," she said, refilling my cup without being asked. "That about the size of it?" Something like that. "Boys had enough people make him small to save themselves the trouble of standing up straight," she said, not unkindly, but without softening it either. I watched it happen from a distance, before he ever told me the whole story. Just watched a boy get quieter and quieter every year he lived here, like he was trying to take up less and less room in the world, so it'd stop finding reasons to hurt him for taking up any at all. First time in 4 years I've seen him let himself get loud again. Actually loud, laughing loud, the kind of loud Pete's kids like, was the week you showed up. She set the pot down, looked at me directly. "So whatever you did, you'd best figure out how to undo it properly, because I don't especially want to watch him go quiet again on my account, and I don't think you want that on yours either." I drove back to the lake house that evening, no closer to an answer, and it was there, sitting on the porch with the framed photograph visible through the window behind me. The mist, the silver water, the private patient love he had for this place long before he had any reason to trust a stranger with it, that I finally understood the actual shape of what I needed to do, and understood with equal clarity that it was going to require doing something I had spent 21 years constructing an entire life specifically to avoid. On the 4th day, I called my mother. I have not, until this point in the story, said very much about my mother, and that is deliberate, because for 35 years I had organized my relationship with her and with the rest of my family around a careful, well-maintained absence of the exact subject I now needed to raise, and I dialed her number with a specific, old fear in my chest that I recognized from being 14 years old and hearing my father use the word lifestyle at a dinner table about someone else's son. "Kamari," she said, warm, surprised. I did not call often enough for it not to be a surprise. "Is everything all right with the house?" "The house is fine, Mom." I stood on the porch, looking out at the darkening lake, and made myself say the next part before I could talk myself out of it again. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to actually hear it, not just let it pass the way this family lets things pass. I'm gay. I have been since I was about 14. I've never told you, or Dad, or anyone at my company, because I decided a long time ago that being loved carefully and conditionally was safer than risking not being loved at all. And I've paid for that decision in ways I only just started understanding this month, because I met somebody up here who's paid a much steeper version of the same bill for daring to be visible about exactly the thing I've spent my whole life hiding. And I am done. I am completely done, being the reason he has to keep paying it." There was a long silence on the line, longer than I was fully braced for, and I stood there with my heart going hard against my ribs, 14 years old again for one terrible suspended moment, waiting for my father's expression to arrive secondhand through my mother's voice. "Okay," my mother said finally, quiet, and something in her voice cracked slightly, not with anger, I understood after a moment, but with something closer to grief, old and specific. "Okay, Kamari, I've known. I think I've known since you were about 16. Your father knew too, I think, longer than either of us ever said out loud to each other, let alone to you. We were cowards about it. I don't have a better word for it than that. We watched you build this whole enormous life, clearly organized around never having to have this conversation with us. And instead of ever bringing it up ourselves, instead of ever telling you it wouldn't cost you what you were so afraid it would cost you, we just let you keep building. It was easier for us. I am sorry it wasn't easier for you. I don't think I have cried, actually cried, in front of another living person since I was in my 20s. And I did not entirely manage it that evening either, standing alone on that porch. But it was close, closer than it had been in a very long time. And I stood there with the phone against my ear and my mother's voice, finally, saying the thing I had spent 21 years afraid to find out she might not say. And I understood that I had just done, with my own family, the exact hard, frightening, overdue thing that Maverick needed to see me capable of doing everywhere else too, and that understanding it was not the same as having done it yet where it actually mattered most.